The other day, Lukáš at Totally Pretentious made a video with the very provocative title, Why Be Well Read? And he gave some very interesting reflections on this question. And just wanted to make a quick, not very well thought out response video because I thought it was a very interesting discussion he sort of started over there. And so first of all, what do we mean by well read? What does it mean to be well read? So firstly, I think it's clear from the context and from his discussion that we're talking about well read in a particular kind of writing, in a particular kind of literature. So it's not like asking why read at all. It's like assuming you're reading, why read those books that we associate with being well read. So it's very similar to asking like, why read the classics? And of course, the term classics is also a very loaded and ambiguous term. And very often, classics is meant, certainly in our Western context, to be synonymous with the classics of the Western canon. And Lukáš makes the point that he doesn't want this discussion to be limited to that canon, to that body of literature. So basically, continuing in that vein, it's possible to imagine someone who has no interest in the Western canon at all, doesn't want to read it, doesn't care for it, but also wants to be well read or is considering whether or not he or she should be well read. And so that might mean being well read in other important literary canons. But another way of sort of conceptualizing this question is like asking why read what is widely considered to be great literature, whatever that means, from any culture, from any society. It's similar to asking the question like why read literary fiction instead of genre fiction. And so when confronted with this kind of open-ended question like this, I'd like to start by just imagining sort of the spectrum of possibilities. What's the space of possible answers? I tend to imagine a spectrum where at one extreme you have answers that are like totally extrinsic to the books themselves. So, for example, maybe it's important to be well read because you fit in better in high society. You have better conversation topics with other people that are in your social circle, or you get references that are in movies and things like that. So that's all pretty external to the experience of that book itself. And those are all potentially valid answers, good reasons potentially to be why you might want to be well read. On the other hand, you have this trickier notion of answers that are intrinsic to the text itself. The sense that there's a sense in which maybe these books are superior, and there's a sense in which maybe reading them is more valuable and more useful in a way that reading books of inferior quality are not. There's some like specific benefit which we accrue by reading great books. And I think it's easy to identify instincts on sort of both sides of this spectrum. On the one hand, it's sort of a truism, which is often stated, and I think it's certainly correct. There's no wrong way to read. Just read what you enjoy. Why would you try to force yourself to read books that you don't enjoy? Just read what you enjoy. And who cares what's considered a great book, a classic, not a classic? Don't let anyone else influence your literary taste. And I think most people would agree with that. That seems certainly valid. But on the other hand, people who read, I think, tend to have an assumption that, like, if they're reading a classic work of literature, there's something superior there to, reading the kind of books that are sold maybe to a mass audience in like airport bookstores for people who are just trying to like fall asleep on an airplane, and these kind of suspense novels that are pumped out very frequently. I don't know anything about that genre. And maybe I'm being unfair. I don't know. But I just think it's an instinct which you can observe, which I think some people certainly seem to express. And I would agree. I think there's probably something to that. And so my angle to this question is informed by my own experience growing up in a religious community. And so growing up, I understood that since I'm a religious person, it's extremely important for me to know my Bible and know it well and to read it and to study it and to understand it because it's a guidebook. It's a book with existential implications for me. And so I did that. I invested the time and the energy and tried to get out of it whatever I could and really see what's there. And then invariably, people like me are going to have these experiences where they're going to sit down with another person of the same religion, and they're going to compare notes. And maybe this person is also of the same religion, but from a different sect, different subgroup within that religion. And he also has the same approach to the holy text, to the Bible, as I do. The same kind of value is placed. There's the same urgency in reading and studying that text. And so we compare notes and say, wow, we share this appreciation. We share this text in common. Let's talk about it. What did you find there? And lo and behold, you realize that there's like almost no common ground. There's like a shocking amount of divergence. And not just on like technical minutia issues that like don't really matter, but like on fundamental questions, like big questions of morality and like what this religion is all about, and so that's pretty scary. And obviously this example can be extended to people who are not religious at all, and they read the same text and they come across very different themes and very different messages and have a totally different reading experience. And so you have to, I think, appreciate when you think about this question that all reading is a kind of encounter between two parties. Those two ingredients, they form a kind of chemical reaction together, and both ingredients can be decisive in influencing the outcome of that interaction. And so back to the original question, why be well-read? Why read great books? What is that all about? The analogy that I like to use for the experience of reading and thinking about these kind of questions is the analogy of travel. Books are like places, and reading a book is like traveling to a place. It has its own kind of atmosphere and its own language and its own logic and psychology and characters. And on the one hand, people should travel to wherever they want to travel. But on the other hand, there's a kind of consensus that certain places have a kind of richness. There's a kind of unique nature to certain places. But ultimately, in the analogy of travel, any travel experience is going to be what you make of it. What you do there is what matters. No matter, you can travel somewhere very, very uninteresting and do a lot with it, and vice versa. And so what do we gain from traveling? What do we gain from reading? Obviously, there's a kind of worldliness. Hopefully, there's a kind of expansion of the mind that comes with that. But I think it's important to be realistic and aware that there's also potentially negative sides of traveling. Harold Bloom wrote a book on the Western canon. And, I love Harold Bloom. He had a big impact on the way I read. And, I think subjectively speaking, from Harold Bloom's perspective, he just loves the Western canon. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with loving what you love. Harold Bloom finds Shakespeare and Dante and John Milton and Melville and whatever, the list goes on, to be like the greatest, Plato, Socrates. Like, he really enjoys that more than anything else, and that's totally legitimate, But when you read some of his rhetoric, and when he's trying to sell you on the Western canon, I mean, some of that stuff is really extreme. Like some of that stuff borders, on like a sense that this is the pinnacle of like human achievement across the world. And he rants in the opening chapters of that book. He rails against like trends in academia where they're trying to like branch out and read about other experiences, and he calls that like Marxist, and he calls that like Foucaultian, and he has all these like labels, and he just totally dismisses it like political. And again, I'm like sympathetic. I think like objectively in his own experience, he appreciates his Western canon more than any other book, and that's fair. That's allowed. You're allowed to like whatever you want. But I think it takes like a kind of narrowness to not appreciate the fact that like human beings are different, and human beings like legitimately appreciate different types of books. And just because the Western canon is the best canon for him and Shakespeare is the best person for him, it doesn't mean that it's the same for everyone. So I figured it would make sense to look up some examples. So I have the Western canon open in front of me. And this is an example of Harold Bloom talking about how the Western canon is under attack. Okay, quote, "The means to destroy canons are very much at hand, and the process is now quite advanced. I am not concerned, as this book repeatedly makes clear, with the current debate between the right-wing defenders of the canon who wish to preserve it for its supposed and non-existent moral values, and the academic journalistic network I have dubbed the School of Resentment, who wish to overthrow the canon in order to advance their supposed and non-existent programs of social change." He goes on to say, "I hope this book does not turn out to be an elegy for the Western canon, and that perhaps at some point there will be a reversal, and the rabblement of lemmings will cease to hurl themselves off the cliff." End quote. Another example. The expansion of the canon has meant the destruction of the canon, since what is being taught includes by no means the best writers, who happen to be women, African, Hispanic, or Asian, but rather writers who offer little but the resentment they have developed as part of their sense of identity. There is no strangeness and no originality in such resentment. Even if there were, they would not suffice to create heirs of the Yahwist in Homer, Dante and Shakespeare, Cervantes and Joyce. End quote. Those are such strong words. And when I read that, it's like boggles the mind. It just boggles the mind that Harold Bloom, who's so brilliant, who I appreciate so deeply, could be so narrow. I don't even know what to say. He doesn't have to enjoy these writers as much as the writers he loves. That's fine. We all like different things. But to assume that because the experience is foreign, because the language, and again, it's maybe the perspective is different. Instead of being the perspective of the colonizer, maybe, for example, it's the perspective of the colonized, perhaps. Therefore, it has no strangeness, no originality. It has little to offer but resentment. What? It's nuts. It's wild. And so those are just some of my thoughts. I think it's important to be well read. But I think it's important to stay broad-minded and to challenge ourselves and to read outside our comfort zone and not to assume so narrowly and so narcissistically that whatever books I find the best are objectively the best for all human beings across the world. That's just wild, you know? Anyway, those are some of my thoughts. Thanks for watching.